Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Recent hurricanes, wildfires, and floods have overwhelmed federal disaster response systems, with FEMA operating at a fraction of its staffing capacity. The GAO warns that workforce reductions and undertrained surge responders could jeopardize future recovery efforts. Here to explain the risks and what needs to change is Director of Homeland Security and Justice at GAO, Christopher Curry. Mr. Curry, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Terry.
GAO is starting a new series of reports addressing federal disaster response readiness. Before we dig into the first report, tell us about why this new series.
Originally, we had planned to do a series looking at the response lessons learned from disasters that happened over the last year. So like last year, Hurricane Helene, Hurricane Milton, and then the LA wildfires. And then, of course, we have the Texas flooding. So originally, we were going to look at just what happened in those disasters, what lessons were learned, what can we do for the future. Of course, over the last 6 to 8 months, there have been a number of actions the administration has taken. Many people have probably heard the discussions about FEMA and its role and what its future is going to be. And so we also felt like that was such an important thing to consider when you look at past responses, that we sort of combine those two things. And that's what we're aiming to do, is provide a snapshot of what's happened, what have we learned, and then what are the current changes happening at the agency, at FEMA, and other agencies. What does that mean for the future?
Well, you also added disaster response to the GAO high-risk list in February. A combination of all of those factors?
Well, actually, a combination of that, but this goes back more than a decade. The reason we added that to the high-risk list is, first of all, just the amount of money we spend on it, almost $500 billion in federal aid for disasters over the last decade, and years and years of work identifying problem areas and frustrations with the disaster recovery process, mainly state and local officials and individual frustration about the complexity of that system. So this has been a problem for a long time. In fact, 2 years ago, we made a recommendation to Congress that it establish a congressional commission because it was such a big problem. We felt like it needed a commission to look across agencies, across congressional committees of jurisdiction to tackle some of these problems. So this has been going on a long time before this was in the news.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And it's also an issue that a lot of people feel personally as these sorts of things happen. Your first report deals with the federal response workforce readiness. Why did you decide to start there, and kind of what did you find?
A couple reasons. First of all, there was a lot of interest in Congress on looking at staffing reductions that have been made at agencies. And this is not just in this space. I think there's a lot of interest in what the administration has done to reduce staffing and its workforce across the federal government, but particularly looking at disaster response and in hurricane season. Folks really wanted to know, well, how many people have left and who left, and what does that mean for our readiness? So, we have the ability to get data from FEMA and talk directly with FEMA and state and local officials. So we felt like this was a very important thing to look at and issue a report at the height of hurricane season.
What were the most surprising or concerning findings about FEMA's workforce readiness?
Well, as we expected, we obviously found reductions at the agency. About 2,500 people have left the agency since the beginning of the year. And, our concern there is that last year, for example, leading into Hurricane Helene and Milton at the peak of hurricane season, FEMA was already basically at no staff available. Everyone was already working on something or deployed. Very few staff were available. And what happened is they had to redirect resources, move people off other disasters to fill the need. In Helene, for example, that was such a massive disaster. There were almost 6,000 federal employees at a certain point deployed. So, obviously the first thing that comes to our mind is, well, if you're already in that situation in the past, what does that mean if we face another catastrophic season like we had at the end of last hurricane season? So, obviously our first concern is that, do we have the right number of people to respond to these types of events? What we really worry about is concurrent events, just like we saw last year or just like we saw in 2017 with Hurricane Harvey, Irma, and then Maria. That's why the workforce numbers are so important.
I'm speaking with Chris Curry. He's a director in the Homeland Security and Justice team at the Government Accountability Office. Chris, it struck me that you documented not only a loss of capacity just in sheer numbers, but you also referenced a loss of institutional knowledge because so many senior leaders have departed FEMA. So how do those two things intersect to affect FEMA's capacity to respond?
This was a natural thing that happened, I think, because of the way the administration decided to reduce its workforce. One of the things it did is provided early retirement incentives. And so, who's going to take those? It's going to be your most experienced staff. So a lot of the FEMA staff that have managed hundreds of disasters, run many of their regions, are the very people that decided to take these early retirements. So when you lose that kind of institutional knowledge, you lose a lot of perspective and insight about how to avoid past mistakes and how to really respond proactively and effectively. So it's a concern when that happens. It's not to say there aren't still a lot of great experienced people at FEMA, but when you lose that many people, it's a concern. Also, honestly, we get concerned about morale. When people are losing their jobs or they're walking on eggshells, they don't do their best work. So it's a concern from multiple angles.
The report's very clear to say that even though the Trump administration has a commission that is looking at reforming FEMA, they haven't changed yet, and FEMA's existing responsibilities persist. So in light of the findings about workforce readiness and capacity, this report isn't specific about recommendations, but what suggestions do you have for the folks who are currently leading FEMA?
Yeah, great question. I mean, one of the goals we have with these products, and you're right, this one doesn't have specific recommendations. One reason for that is because the FEMA Commission is currently doing its work. We wanted some of these reports to inform the Commission's work in addition to some of our past work. And so we're hoping it does that. And on the issue of FEMA still having the same responsibilities, I mean, just as an example, just this morning, FEMA declared and approved 6 new disaster declarations. So the point we wanted to make is, besides all the talk and the rhetoric around changes at FEMA or changes in roles and responsibilities between the levels of government, today nothing has changed yet. And FEMA has not communicated anything to the states and localities in a concrete way. So if you're a state or a locality, you're trying to figure out, well, as I prepare for a hurricane or a wildfire, what can I expect from the federal government? And this is what we heard from states. It's hard in this space. What you don't want to do when you're preparing for disasters is have any sort of question about roles and responsibilities. That was how we got ourselves in the predicament leading up to Hurricane Katrina, which resulted in a number of response failures.
You make the point that FEMA doesn't act alone in these disasters. The Army Corps of Engineers, EPA, many other federal agencies have to be mobilized in case of a natural disaster. Does this loss of capacity at FEMA impact their ability to collaborate in cross-agency environments?
Yes, I mean, there's fewer people at FEMA, so it does have an impact. But actually, this is a huge takeaway that if you take anything away from this, I think this is really important. There's a cumulative effect to all these reductions. So this is not just a FEMA issue. FEMA is the quarterback, so to speak, of the federal response, but many other federal agencies, Department of Transportation, the Corps of Engineers, EPA, Department of Defense, they are responsible for doing what FEMA tells them to do in a response. Many of these agencies, and we documented in the report, such as the Corps of Engineers and EPA, they have lost staff as well. And so they are not in a position to respond as effectively. Also, FEMA has a surge force of volunteers and DHS and other components it uses, and they have right now about half of the number of people in that volunteer force that they had last year. So this is not just a FEMA problem. This is why we named the report the Federal Response Workforce, because it's the whole federal workforce, not just FEMA.
And GAO being a ledge branch organization, are you getting any response from legislators about this issue? And have they asked for clarification or information to help them move forward with reform?
Oh, yes. I think members of Congress and their staff are very, concerned about this issue, and not just ones that are in hurricane-prone states. I think we've had a lot of interest from people all over the country in different regions about, what does this mean for our readiness and our ability to respond? Because, states and localities are held accountable for their response to these disasters as well. They want to make sure they understand what support they're going to get from FEMA and what they can expect. And if that's going to change, they need that information to start doing something different right now to prepare. And that's a very important part of this, is that there's going to have to be a phasing process and a staging process for this, to where first we understand how things are going to change, and then we start to understand, well, what are the steps we can get to build capacity to get in whatever new situation we have.
Can you share with us what report might come up next?
Yeah, so right now we're working on a couple reports. One is looking at this very issue I just talked about. So we're looking at what we're calling state and local capacity and preparedness. So there's a lot of data and information out there that shows how ready different states and localities are throughout the country. There's a wide variation. So one of the things we want to catalog is what those differences look like across the country, and then what states and localities have told us about what they would have to do to take on more responsibility. So again, we want to help inform the council. We want everyone to have the information they need. A third one we're looking at too is, maybe one of the most important issues, which is, how is this going to affect assistance to individuals? So, in the days following a disaster, FEMA provides life-saving support, search and rescue. It provides food, shelter, temporary housing. That may be the most important thing FEMA does to save lives and to help people. And we want to look at those programs and understand how they're changing and what this means for the future.
I've been speaking with Chris Curry. He's a director in the Homeland Security and Justice team at the Government Accountability Office. Thanks so much for explaining this report for us.
Thank you so much.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.